Imagine waking up in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
The air raid sirens are wailing, but, you've heard them 100 times before. So you decide to just get out of bed and go down to the basement. Not even out of sheer panic, I mean. Mostly just to grab a snack and, wait it out.
Huh.
And then literally seconds later, a kamikaze drone just vaporizes your living room.
Wow.
Yeah. The doors, the windows, the fences outside, everything just blows inward and shatters. And in that exact terrifying moment, as you are standing there in the basement covered in dust, I have to ask, how much do you care about the long-term philosophical trajectory of global politics?
I would guess probably not at all.
Exactly. Not at all. Because your entire universe has just violently shrunk to the next 30 seconds. But today, in this deep dive, we're actually going to look at why ignoring that exact philosophical trajectory might be, the very thing that brought that drone to your window in the first place.
It really is the ultimate collision of two completely incompatible timelines.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, you have this desperate, immediate physical reality of survival. But on the other hand, you have the absolute necessity for like a 30-year intellectual vision to ensure that your survival actually means something in the end.
Which is such a massive tension. And to explore that tension today, we are unpacking a really intense stack of sources.
Very intense.
First, we have this translated transcript of a YouTube broadcast from the channel novini.love. It's a sprawling, really deep-in-the-weeds interview with the philosopher Serhii Datsiuk.
Right.
And then immediately following that, almost as if to just rip us right out of the philosopher's armchair and throw us into the fire, we have a raw, on-the-ground news report of that exact drone strike I just described, which happened in the city of Odessa.
And again, before we really get into the weeds with Datsiuk's arguments today, I think it's crucial to point out that we're stepping into a bit of a minefield here.
Oh, absolutely.
Because this source material contains some very highly charged political opinions. I mean, we're talking critiques of global figures like Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, deep dives into the Ukraine-Russia war, and some pretty intense debates over the canceling of cultural heritage.
Yeah, it covers a lot of controversial ground.
Right. So I want to make it completely clear to you listening that we aren't here to endorse or debunk his politics.
Yeah.
And we certainly aren't taking any sides.
No, not at all.
Rather, we are just going to use these viewpoints as a lens, to impartially report on and really try to understand his overarching theory on human leadership and societal collapse.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because we have to start with Datsiuk's core argument, which is essentially that modern society completely misunderstands what leadership actually is.
Yes.
Like, he argues that we're facing this terrifying evolution of social division specifically because we lack true intellectual leaders.
Yeah. Datsiuk draws a very sharp, very deliberate line between a leader and what he calls a manager. He argues that the people running the world today, and he means across almost all global governments and institutions, are essentially just late 20th century managers.
So how does he actually define a manager in this context? Because, it sounds like he means someone who just reads the room, looks at the polling data, and then rides whatever the prevailing trend is.
Precisely. That is exactly it. A manager's job is just to optimize the current reality.
Okay.
They look at the analytics, they see where the crowd is already running, and they essentially sprint to the front of the parade so it looks like they are leading.
That's a great image.
But they aren't changing the destination. A true intellectual leader, according to Datsiuk, does something entirely different. An intellectual leader presents a completely new vision.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they demand that we step outside the existing broken reality and build a completely new one from scratch.
Which is hard. And historically, he points out, society absolutely hates these people.
Oh, they despise them.
Yeah. Intellectual leaders aren't rewarded. They are treated as outcasts. Historically, these are the people who get thrown in jail or exiled or killed simply because they say things that fundamentally disrupt the comfort and the, established narratives of the majority.
He actually mentions feeling like a marginalized outcast since childhood himself because of how his mind works.
Really?
Yeah. And he definitely doesn't shy away from applying this critique directly to the highest levels of current leadership.
Right, like with Zelensky.
Exactly. For instance, he acknowledges President Zelensky for the undeniable human feat of staying in Kyiv when the invasion started.
Which was huge.
He does not diminish that physical bravery at all. But Datsiuk argues that Zelensky is fundamentally not an intellectual leader.
And that's because he hasn't offered a completely new reality, right?
That's his argument.
Right.
From Datzik's philosophical perspective, a true leader would have either engineered a reality that prevented the war entirely, or, once they were in it, offered a completely new discourse to lead the country out of it. Because he hasn't done that, Datsik views him as merely managing the crisis, optimizing the current state of war, rather than transcending it.
And because society lacks these intellectual leaders to build that new discourse, Datsuk argues that we don't just become divided. We undergo this process he calls Bubbleization.
Bubbleization.
Which I have to say just sounds so innocent until you hear how he actually defines it.
It really does.
I mean, it's like we used to live in a giant house with a broken wall. We could yell at the neighbors, we could argue, the politics were messy and loud, but we still saw them. We still shared a physical reality. But now we're living in soundproof glass boxes.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. And Datsik is adamant that this is not just a split in society.
What's the difference?
Well, a split implies that two pieces of the same whole are still looking at each other. They can, theoretically, be glued back together. You can negotiate across a split. But bubbles are capsules. That means total, impenetrable isolation.
So what does that actually look like on the ground in daily life?
It means zero horizontal social mobility.
Okay.
You lose friends, family, and colleagues who don't share your exact reality, and you replace them only with people inside your bubble.
Wow.
Furthermore, there is zero vertical mobility. You cannot rise in society unless you perfectly conform to the extreme ideological purity of your specific bubble.
That's terrifying.
And crucially, it means the absolute death of public politics. There is no debate anymore, only the enforcement of the bubble's internal rules.
But wait, I have to push back here a little bit. Because Datsik's demand feels, I don't know, a bit detached from human psychology.
How so?
Well, if you look at your own life, isn't this isolation just a natural, unavoidable defense mechanism during a crisis? I mean, if you are under constant existential threat, of course you retreat into a bubble with people who think exactly like you.
Right.
It's emotional survival. You just hunker down with your tribe.
What's fascinating here is how Datsuk actually addresses that exact defense mechanism. He understands why we do it, but he argues that when people lock themselves in these soundproof glass boxes, they lose the critical ability to analyze their own reality from the outside.
Because they're stuck inside.
Exactly. You can no longer assess if your strategy for survival is actually working, because everyone around you is just echoing that it is.
You completely lose your objective perspective.
Yes. And more dangerously, he points out that these bubbles don't just sustain themselves peacefully, they are fueled entirely by psychological manipulation and resentment.
Resentment.
Yeah. Whoever screams the loudest, whoever exhibits the most visceral hatred for the other, becomes the dominant voice dictating the reality inside the bubble.
Oh, wow.
Datsuk warns that this total isolation paves the way for a creeping, normalized authoritarianism. People slowly accept the unacceptable, like the erosion of civil rights, or the prospect of an endless grinding conflict.
Because they are completely cut off from any alternative perspective.
Exactly. They literally cannot imagine another way out because the bubble doesn't allow that imagination to exist.
Right. And if people are isolated in these glass boxes, they need a shared story to make sense of the isolation. Which leads us to the next big point. Datsuk argues that society is feeding them a very specific and very dangerous diet of wartime myth-making.
Yes, the myth-making machine.
There's this old political science cliche that politics is the art of the possible. You compromise, you negotiate taxes, you build roads. But Datsuk says that in times of war, politics must become the art of the impossible.
And by impossible, he means the heavy lifting of completely changing reality.
Okay.
In peacetime, you manage the economy. In wartime, you have to invent a completely new reason for your nation to exist post-conflict. You have to conceptualize a future that currently seems unimaginable.
But instead of doing the impossible work of building that new discourse, he argues society is just leaning heavily on comfortable historical myths.
Like what?
Well, the sources highlight the elevation of historical figures like Taras Shevchenko and Stepan Bandera, and the reliance on these abstract ideas like a genetic code of the nation.
Right.
And on the flip side of that myth-making, there's the canceling of cultural heritage. Datsuk explicitly mentions the canceling of figures like the writer Mikhail Bulgakov, or even discarding the historical concept of Kievan Rus.
Which he sees as a mistake.
Huge mistake. He argues that by doing this, society is just handing its own complex cultural history over to the enemy in the name of ideological purity.
And this reliance on managed myth over complex reality is perfectly illustrated by his critique of the Telemarathon.
Oh, the unified news broadcast in Ukraine?
Exactly, the state-sponsored broadcast. Datsuk points to the sociology around who is actually watching this.
The numbers he drops are wild.
They really are.
He states that the Telemarathon is only supported by about 37% of the population. And when you break that demographic down, he says it's roughly 25% rural pensioners and 12% urban pensioners. Meanwhile, he claims that intellectuals, professionals, and business people completely ignore it. They are just living in a totally different information space.
Yet the leadership continues to make decisions and gauge public sentiment based on this entirely distorted sociology.
Why would they do that?
Because the broadcast acts as a closed-loop system. The politicians look at the 37% approval of the broadcast and think, oh, we're managing the crisis perfectly, while 63% of the country is living in a totally different reality.
That is a massive blind spot.
And this reliance on a managed narrative leads to strategic dead ends. For instance, Datsuk heavily criticizes the stated national strategy of simply outlasting Russia by 1 hour.
His response to that is so incredibly dark.
It is.
He mocks the idea of outlasting the enemy by an hour by saying, great, I'll die an hour later.
Yeah.
He calls this a strategy of slow dying.
It's a brutal assessment of endurance disguised as victory.
But again, I find myself wanting to challenge the philosopher here. Because when a country is literally under physical assault, you need historical myths to consolidate the public, don't you?
It seems like it, yeah.
I mean, you can't ask a bleeding population to act like high-level academic theorists. You need a unified, black-and-white story to keep people fighting. Isn't Datsuk just being, I don't know, an elitist by demanding a nuanced discourse while rockets are falling?
That is a natural counterargument, and it's a strong one. But Datsuk's synthesis of this dynamic is actually profound. He explains the hidden cost of those unifying myths.
Which is what?
He believes that if your survival is based purely on hating the enemy, if your entire national identity becomes nothing more than a mirror image resentment of the aggressor, you permanently tie your existence to them.
Because your whole identity is just, we're the opposite of you.
Exactly. If your only unifying goal is the destruction of the other, you are guaranteeing mutual destruction. Your society loses its own independent purpose. You are just a function of the enemy's actions. You win the war, perhaps, but you lose your actual reason to exist as a society the day after the peace treaty is signed.
Wow. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So where does this new discourse come from, if the people fighting the war are too consumed by it to create it?
Historically, Datsuk notes, this new discourse rarely comes from the people currently managing the crisis. It usually comes from the outcasts, or even immigrants who have the physical and mental distance to think clearly.
Oh, interesting.
He references the historical philosopher's ships from the early 20th century. You know, intellectuals forced to flee who created new ideas abroad.
Yeah.
He wonders if today we need philosophical planes to carry thinkers away so they can imagine a future outside the pressurized bubble of war.
And what's terrifying is that he doesn't just see this as a local problem. The sources show Datsuk taking this exact same critique, this missing intellectual leadership, this bubbleization, and applying it to the entire globe.
He zooms way out.
Way out. He predicts a 30-year horizon of global degradation.
30 years of global decay.
Yeah, and he points to the most mundane, everyday things to prove it's already happening right under our noses. Like, he talks about the Uber app.
The Uber app.
Yeah, he says, look, you used to be able to order an Uber, and it arrived instantly. Now you open the app, it spins, it searches for 5, 7, 10 minutes, and then it just cancels the ride.
Oh, that's so true.
Right. The quality of the service has fundamentally degraded, but the app still looks exactly the same. The interface is shiny, but the mechanism is broken.
It's like software rot.
Yes.
No single line of code breaks the system overnight, but years of patching over bugs instead of rewriting the foundation eventually makes the whole program crash. Datsuk's point is that nobody officially announces that the reality has changed and the service is broken.
We just slowly accept it.
Exactly. We adjust our expectations downward.
And he sees this same software rot, this same lack of intellectual leadership at the very top of the global food chain. Take his critique of Donald Trump.
Right. Datsuk argues that Trump completely lacks the intellectual leadership required to establish any sort of new world order.
Okay.
Instead of making grand paradigm-shifting alliances, like somehow fundamentally altering the global dynamic to make Russia an ally, he predicts Trump will just fall back on transactional manager tactics.
Like just forcing Russia to restrict its ties with China in exchange for short-term concessions?
Yes.
It's deal-making, not world-building.
Exactly. And Datsiak makes a fascinating prediction regarding Trump and the media.
Oh.
He says that if Trump were to wage a prolonged multi-year war, he wouldn't rely on a free press. Datsiak argues that Trump would be forced to create his own version of the unified Telemarathon to control the narrative.
Seriously?
Yeah, because that is simply what happens to manager-style politics during an endless crisis. The art of the possible collapses into pure narrative control.
That is wild. He even takes a shot at Elon Musk and the whole Mars colony vision. He calls it a total false hope.
Does he really?
Yeah. Datsiak argues that if we don't first do the hard intellectual work of building a new, functional civilization here on Earth, taking rockets to Mars is completely pointless.
Why? I mean, what's his reasoning?
Because Musk is trying to solve a philosophical problem with engineering. Datsiak's point is that if you take the exact same degraded societal structures, the same bubbleized human behaviors, and put them on a spaceship, you haven't saved humanity.
Right.
You've just exported our dysfunction to another planet.
That makes perfect sense.
A colony built by people who haven't figured out how to live together on Earth will inevitably tear itself apart on Mars. Datsiak says they'll eventually just send back a final disconnect message to a ruined planet, and that will be the end of it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Datsiak is warning that humanity is currently substituting true strategy with mere resilience. We're confusing technological advancement like building bigger rockets, writing sleeker apps, with actual societal progress.
It is a heavy, heavy philosophical burden to place on the world. I mean, he's essentially saying the whole world has stopped thinking and is just bracing for impact.
Yeah.
But this is exactly where our source material forces us to confront the limits of philosophy. Because we have to reconcile this demand for a 30-year intellectual horizon with a reality where survival is measured in seconds.
Right. This is where we bring the abstract philosophy crashing down into the visceral ground truth. The second part of our source material is that raw news report from Odessa on March 2nd.
It was a morning attack, right?
Yes. Kamikaze drones struck the city, specifically targeting and destroying civilian infrastructure and a private home. And it instantly sparked a massive fire.
And the eyewitness accounts in this transcript are just terrifying in their randomness. We mentioned it at the top of the show. There is an account from someone who was asleep, woke up to the air raid sirens, and decided to go down to the basement just to eat something.
Just for a snack.
Yeah. That incredibly mundane decision, just wanting a snack, saved their life. They survived the blast by a matter of seconds.
Unbelievable.
They were down there with their little sister while their parents were away. A few seconds difference, a slight hesitation in the hallway, and they wouldn't be here.
Another eyewitness describes the sheer surreal horror of it. They looked out their window and saw the drone flying right there, hovering right outside the glass.
Oh my God.
And then a massive explosion. They described the doors, the windows, the sills, the fences, everything just blowing inward, completely shattered, lying in ruins on the floor.
You hear this, you read these accounts of fences literally flying through living rooms, and suddenly the philosopher's demand for a new discourse feels almost alien.
You read that.
It feels like an absurd luxury.
Right.
If you wake up and see a kamikaze drone hovering outside your bedroom window, your priority isn't a new paradigm. Your priority isn't horizontal social mobility.
No.
Your priority is the basement.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important question of this entire deep dive. How do we reconcile Datsiak's absolute desperate need for intellectual strategy with the reality of the basement?
Right.
And the answer is, this immediate horrifying physical reality is precisely why society retreats into the bubbles and the myths that Datsiak so deeply despises.
Because you just don't have the mental space for it. The cognitive load is maxed out just trying to stay alive.
Exactly. When people are facing daily, split-second existential threats, they do not have the cognitive bandwidth for complex philosophical debate. You cannot deconstruct wartime mythology when you are actively pulling shattered glass out of your walls.
You just can't.
The human brain prioritizes the immediate physical threat over the long-term abstract threat every single time.
So the tragedy here is that the very survival instincts keeping people alive today, the bubbles, the unified narratives, the pure, stubborn resilience, might be the exact things preventing the creation of a viable tomorrow. To survive the night, you have to burn the blueprints of the house just to stay warm.
That is the terrible math of this crisis. Datsiak is right that without a blueprint, the house will never be rebuilt. But the people in Odessa are right that without the fire, they freeze to death right now.
So what does this all mean? We've traveled from the philosophical heights of intellectual leadership, societal bubbles, and 30-year global degradation, all the way down to the terrifying split-second reality of a drone strike shattering a window in Odessa.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, and I want you, the listener, to think about this in the context of your own world. Think about the crises we face globally. Are we just managing our problems, patching over the software rot, or are we actually trying to envision a new way out of them?
It's a very necessary reflection. And actually, I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder, something that builds on Datsyuk's fear of a world without true leaders.
What's that?
Think about our current massive global obsession with artificial intelligence.
Okay.
Are we pouring billions into hoping AI will act as the ultimate, perfectly rational manager to optimize our broken reality, precisely because we've fundamentally given up on producing actual human intellectual leaders who can imagine a new one?
Oh, wow.
Have we outsourced our 30-year vision to an algorithm because we're too busy hiding in the basement?
The algorithm or the architect? Which one are we actually waiting for? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.